Hello, everyone. Hi. We excited today? I know after Randy's big presentation, I always have to follow that. And Alex told us a lot about how to make money, so I'm going to try to show you how we've done it. My name is Adam Boys. I had 2 Russian exchange students live with me for a year, so I learned 10 words in Russian. So, здравствуйте, меня зовут Adam. And then I learned how to say like good and хорошо, очень хорошо, очень плохо. So they didn't learn any English, so I had to learn some Russian. So it's very nice to see you all today. Thanks for coming by. I want to give you a quick background. So I started in video games about 23 years ago. Started as a QA tester at Electronic Arts up in Canada. I'm from Canada. That's why I'm passionate about hockey. So we have something big time in common there. I've been around the block, been to many companies throughout my years, starting quality assurance, working into production, ran product development at Capcom, at PlayStation. I did a few things, and then I joined Iron Galaxy because I want to get back to video game development. Another job that I had was I was an X-Wing pilot. I got to do a trial run on an X-Wing to promote Battlefront. But many of you might recognize me from PlayStation, where I ran third-party relations. Had a great job there, worked there for over 4 years, loved working with developers and publishers all throughout the games industry. But I really lost that passion for actually making things, for making content. And so I had worked in Chicago at Midway, so I wanted to join video game development again. So I joined Iron Galaxy, which when you say Iron Galaxy, it doesn't mean a lot to very many people. People are kind of like, who? What do you guys do? Is that Iron Horse? So Iron something? They always forget the name of the company. So you've probably heard some of the games we've worked on. Here's just a few. Here's about, I'd say 5-8% of the games that we've worked on. How many people have played one of these games? Yeah, pretty much. So a lot of great franchises we've had the privilege of working on throughout all the years. But it didn't start that way. It was a small little studio. So I want to tell you the story about how we grew from this one chucklehead, Dave Lang. He's our founder of the company, to be able to work on all these fantastic franchises. So if we go back in time a little bit, there was a company called Midway, which a lot of people knew about. Back in the 80s and 90s, did a lot of arcade games that many of you are familiar with. And Dave Lang was the head of Central Technology. So he was running all the tech teams for the whole studio. And at the time, Midway was working on a ton of different franchises, primarily in Unreal Engine 3. Here are some of them. You've probably heard of at least one of these 5. The other 4, maybe not so much. But they were all be done in Unreal Engine 3. And at the time, it was PS3. As many of you who back in the day worked on PS3 with UE3, was very difficult. And so Dave and his team of technologists had cracked the code of how to fix UE3 for PS3. So he decided one day, as Midway was basically shit in the bed, as they say, decided to jump ship. And so he had this idea. His idea was, hey, I figured out how to make Unreal Engine 3 very performant on PS3. So I could go to Epic, and I could fix it once, or I could start my own company, and I could do it over and over and over again. And so that was his idea. I want to start my own company. I want to fix Unreal Engine 3 for a bunch of different companies around the industry. Now, that's a pretty big undertaking. So I'm going to show you all the flashy games that he got to work with his team in the first couple years. I don't know if any of you have heard of any of these, but maybe you don't know Jack. That's a pretty big one. Bionic Commando, the 8-bit version for Nintendo, was pretty cool. But this is the first couple years. It was very difficult for them to get work. Luckily, I was working at Capcom at the time, and so Dave and his team of engineers were willing to help out, do some online development for Bionic Commando. They helped with Dark Void, which was an original IP that was being done at Capcom as well. Snood was this mobile game that Jason Rubin actually worked on, which is kind of funny. You Don't Know Jack was a sort of a puzzle fun game, and Connect Adventures. So the early years weren't as glamorous, right? This big, huge vision of let's work on the biggest games in the industry wasn't about to happen overnight. But there was one thing the studio was very passionate about, and they're passionate about fighting games. A lot of the people at the studio had worked on Mortal Kombat. Ended up getting to work on Street Fighter Third Strike for Capcom, and ended up, even from that point, getting to work on Killer Instinct, where we took that over for about 5 years once Double Helix got purchased by Amazon. But how did we get there? Because the slide previously didn't really show any of the big IPs. And like Randy said, you got to crawl before you walk. So there was a ton of crawling. One thing we had to do is we had to get good at looking at other people's source code, right? When you're a work-for-hire studio, you're exposed to a lot of source code and a lot of other people's sort of secrets. So you have to get pretty good at looking at it and analyzing it. So I want to walk you through some of the ways that we did that. The first thing, obviously, is source code is like everyone's baby, right? It's like getting to look through all of their Twitter DMs for years and years and years, right? So the first thing you have to do is you have to build trust. The partner has to trust you to be able to look at the source code. So you have to establish yourself. You have to have a bit of a reputation, hopefully, and then find a partner that's going to let you have access to their source code. It can be a very challenging aspect. This talk isn't about building trust. We'll do that next year at DevCam. But it's more about having to find those partners. Second thing is you're going to sign a contract to be able to look at the source code. You have to read it multiple times. You know, contracts can be the bearer of bad news, but also good news. So make sure you read through the contract. Sometimes when you do an analysis of a game and you don't read the contract closely, you won't realize that you might have given up rights of any of your own work that you've potentially done in the future, or in the past, I'm sorry. And then what you have to do is basically once you get the source code, once the contract's done, basically take a look at it. Okay, did they send over all the stuff? Is it all present? Is all the documentation there? Did we get the right login to the GitHub? You know, is it present? Is the first stage. And the second stage is verifying. Can we, once we get the source code, can the data get built? We don't need to just be able to see the source code. We need to be able to run it. We need to throw breakpoints around. It's a very, very important aspect when you're looking and reviewing someone else's source code. The next thing you have to do is build your squad, right? If you're looking into source code, you need to make sure you have specialists that truly understand the various aspects of the code. So is it a rendering heavy game? Do you need somebody that's really great at graphics performance? Is it in Unity or UE4? Making sure you have engineers on the team that has one of those experiences. Is there multiplayer? Does it have live services? Stuff like that. So when you're analyzing source code, it's very important that you have specialists that can dig into it and find all the problems as, let's say, you're building an RFP or some quote. And then the fun stuff, right? Digging into the code, finding the secrets, finding the comments in the source where developers are making fun of each other. And that part is the first stage of digging into the code. The second stage is looking for all the problem areas, right? Where did all the crimes happen? Where did they steal CPU perf for some other trade-off? How much lead time is it going to take to ramp up people? How much sort of change and improvements have they made over time to the source code itself? Then you get to basically dig right into it, right? You're looking for bad situations. You're trying to dig through the code itself, really get into it, get in the nitty-gritty. Like I said, throwing breakpoints around, finding out where problems are occurring. And of course, one of the most important aspects is performance captures. There's a lot of awesome software out there that helps you do these performance captures. So making sure you're placing markers in the code, you're seeing exactly what's impacting the performance overall. That's a super, super important part of it, especially when you get an animation and stuff like that. On top of that, there's a little tricks of the trade. If you pick UE4, how is your team utilizing Blueprint, right? Is that having a negative impact on the performance? If it's on Unity, what are you trying to do? We worked on 7 Days to Die for Telltale at the time, which was made by the Fun Pimps, and it was an open world Unity game for console. Those three things usually don't go together. So there's a lot of problems and issues that we uncovered through the process. Or is it a custom engine, right? Was it built by a bunch of friends in a basement? That's going to be a lot harder for a problem to solve. And then if it has cross-platform, you start to add a lot of layers of complexity. If it's PC, cross Mac, cross iOS, cross Android. And then the big, big issue is there sort of cross back-end engine, right? There's very few games so far that have cross-play. There's a lot of different adherences if you're putting yourself out on all these different platforms. There's TRCs and TCRs you need to do, and it's very difficult, especially when you have access to dev kits and all that stuff. It can be super challenging. And the other time that it can be challenging is when you get access to the source code, right? If you get the source code too early, not enough stuff is done, and so you don't know if this stuff's final, and if we're doing performance improvement planning, is this the right thing to do? If it's too late and they're shipping in 3 months, you can't really make any improvements. So those are all the aspects that sort of allowed us to learn how to do the code reviews, source code sort of optimizations, and that sort of led to the early years where we worked on a bunch of different products here. We ended up getting the Third Strike gig with Capcom, porting that over to XBLA and PSN, able to work on Scribblenauts for mobile. Tron, we got to work on that. We did Back to the Future with Telltale, worked on both of the Bioshock 2 and Bioshock Infinite, did a bunch of DLC for that stuff. Did some really interesting partnership with Microsoft, with Crimson Dragon and D4, and with Capcom again, with Dungeons & Dragons, Chronicles of Mystaria, and Darkstalkers. So it allowed us to get our sort of the first 3-4 years, once we learned how to look at source code and be able to analyze it very well, we could sort of move on to the next chapter. The next chapter was ports themselves. We do a lot of ports as a studio. So the next part of the journey was, how do we get really good at ports? And so it's a perfect reason why Randy's in the room is we had the opportunity to work on Borderlands 2 for the Vita. It was a very awesome opportunity. We're all a huge amount of fans in the studio. So it was awesome to be able to take this massive, huge game in UE3 and bring it to the PlayStation Vita. Now, that all being said, it was a huge undertaking, a big technical challenge, right? When PlayStation first talked about the Vita, they talked about a console in your pocket. It turns out it's more like a mobile phone in your pocket. So we had to do a ton of revamping. When you're basically looking to port a UE3 game, you usually go to the minimum spec on PC to see what's possible there. But Vita was lower than the min-spec PC for Borderlands 2, so there was a lot of extra work we had to do. We basically had to build like a whole mobile UE3 component to it. And of course, the first priority was to focus on performance, right? We want to make sure, how's the frame rate going in certain areas? When you have a certain amount of characters on screen, what's happening there? When there's tons of guns everywhere and enemies, do you have to, what point does the CPU tap out, So that was sort of stage one. And stage two was the memory itself, right? Where are we memory constrained within the game? And Borderlands 2 is a massive game. So of course we came across a lot of memory constraints. And one of the ones I like to show is, this is not Borderlands, but this is a ragdoll effect on a random character. And in Borderlands, as you know, when you kill a character, it ragdolls. Well, on the PlayStation Vita, if you were killing lots of characters like you do, then there was a ton of ragdoll. And that basically brought the Vita to its knees. So what we had to do is we had to auto-gib the enemies as soon as you killed them, so we didn't have this sort of physics issues going around all over the place. The other thing we had to do is look at the level of detail strategy. So as many of you know, when you build a game, you have multiple level of details throughout the whole entire project. And so we had to obviously figure out which LODs we're going to chop at what points. And the other thing that was super important to the project was we had to do a massive art pass reduction in the polygons of the characters, right? The Vita can't push as many pixels, and so it's very important for us to mindfully do a massive sort of polygon reduction. And if that was a whole entire art team, it would have taken 6 people, probably 9 months. So we had to build a very robust automated tool set to be able to take each of the character models, each of the enemy models, the gun models, and basically automatically bring that down, and then have a team of artists authenticate that stuff and make sure that it looked great and was still sort of representative of the game. So that was super important, right? Sometimes you have to build great tools in order to make a lot of things happen in a short amount of time. The other aspect of it, whenever you look at someone else's code, is sometimes you don't understand all aspects of it. And oftentimes it's easy to just say to yourself, hey, it must mean it's broken. Turns out that's not true. If you don't understand an aspect of the code, means basically you might not understand sort of how they wrote it or what their intention was. So don't assume it's broken. A lot of people will try to fix it, right? That's the first sort of reaction they have, is let's get in there, let's fix it, let's go on to the next thing. So that was sort of the second stage. Once we understood how to take source code and analyze it very thoroughly, the second stage was figuring out how to do ports well how to identify issues, all the while, unlike Randy's example earlier, where when you're working with a company like Valve on Half-Life and you don't have to check in, when you're working on ports, you're checking in very frequently with the developer and the publisher as well. So you have to make sure you're standing up to the level of their quality and stuff like that. Super important. The next phase of our evolution was, we got Killer Instinct. We had a lot of fun doing that project. But that project taught us something brand new that we had never done before. Back in the day, in the 90s, you would make a game, you would ship it, right? It would get pressed on a disk, it would go out to everyone in the world, and you'd never have to patch it. So if you had any bugs, right, in old NES days, it would just get shipped. That's it. But in Killer Instinct, we were doing new updates every single month. And this was 4 or 5 years ago. So it was a lot earlier than a lot of people now that games as a service is now a normal thing, right? So we had to figure out how do we change and improve as a company. There's a lot of fundamental changes we have to make in order to get there. Now, the good news is, because we had a lot of early experience, were able to take our Killer Instinct experience and convince Bethesda to trust us with the Elder Scrolls Online. So ZeniMax had never done a console version, so they came to us with a PC source code, and the only real experience we had with live services was Killer Instinct. And they were able to trust us with doing the PS4 and the Xbox One ports of Elder Scrolls Online, which was a massive undertaking. I mean, think about a game that it wasn't even built for a console at all. There's a lot of discussions with the first party that you have to do and sort of establishing and building that trust up. It was super, super important. And then that led to our work on Fallout 76. And then from there, Blizzard was impressed with the work we had done with Bethesda historically. And we were able to work on Diablo 3 for Nintendo Switch with them. But all that was because we learned all about live services. So I'm going to take you through some of the challenges we faced and how we were able to pivot the company to get a little bit better at live services overall. The start of it is very hard, right? Because we're very used to just building things linearly. You build something, you put it out there, you authenticate it, it's good to go. But when a game is changing, it's basically every single day of development is a little bit different. And when you start getting feedback in from gamers and fans, it becomes even more difficult. So you have to be changing constantly all the time. And that means that you're throwing your plans out the window. When I came up in production, we only all learned one way of game development, and that was the left side, waterfall. Right? Waterfall is the classic production technique that back in the 90s, that's how we did things. Right? You build your concept, you start working on it, you analyze it, you design, you start constructing it and building it. And it's very much like you have 3,000 tasks you need to do, and you're going to do them in order. And that's how it works. And every artist knows that they're going to make 100 pieces of thing A, and every programmer knows they have to build these 6 systems, and that's how it works. Well, the new world we had to pivot to is a completely fluid world of Agile development. Now, this is all to all of you. Most of you probably use Agile anyway. But back in our day, everyone followed waterfall. That was sort of the normal way in which we all made games and made content together. So now it's more of a cyclical thing where each of the teams are changing and moving and evolving and flowing over time. The other area that took us a ton of time to figure out was a branch strategy. So when you have a base level of source code, especially when you're working on someone else's branch. So let's say this main branch, this is the PC version, right? This is the ZeniMax version right here of Elder Scrolls Online. Well, we got the PS4 version up there. We have the Xbox One version up there. How do we push those fixes and stuff back into the mainline branch? And then as you start adding other SKUs and other platforms and new features, it gets way, way more complex. So you basically have to build a whole entire team to reiterate all the changes and things that you make along the timeline. If you don't, the group working on this mainline branch, right, which is the ZeniMax Online team, is going to get very confused if you start making alterations to the source code that they built. So it took us about 2 years to really master the art of completely redefining, reevaluating our branching strategy, and then being able to roll in updates on a regular basis. Especially now that patching is a little bit easier, but back in the day, you got to think about patching for consoles would take sometimes a month or two for every single change. And so your branch strategy might be delayed, right? Where the PC update could be uploaded tomorrow to Steam, The Xbox and PlayStation one might take 2 months for that update to get. So back in the day, a lot of us used to complain about how they're out of sync. PC version's further ahead. It's because there was less sort of approvals and reviews that you had to do. The other thing we had to do is completely change the way we communicated, right? Communication used to be a very top-down, your art director's like, these are the 100 widgets you're going to make this week, Jeff. So Jeff would start making those widgets. Programmer X would have to make these 3 features. But when you're changing everything every day, and especially when, let's say you put your game out and there's a huge bug, and that has a ripple impact, and now that that one feature you thought was super important isn't anymore. One of the good examples I like to use is at Midway, we were working on a game called NBA Ballers, and they made this whole entire road to the show, this whole entire experience that probably took about 30% of the development time and effort and was only played by 4% of the players. So when you think about how much time and effort you're putting into things, you're going to have to change, especially nowadays when you know that right away. You put a game out, you see where people are spending time. So now we had to move to a lot more fluid communication style, talk, daily stand-ups, getting Slack, and we use Microsoft Teams. And the other thing we had to do was instead of having this sort of very much top-down approach of you have 5 leads, and each of those leads are telling people what to do, we had to break the team into much smaller pods. And each pod was together. There might be an artist, a programmer, a designer, all working together on one feature or another, right? But they're allowed to move far more faster because they're not constrained by the different things around them, right? So even though they're all part of a bigger team, right? They're part of a huge team, it allows them to make a lot of progress, right? They get to move unhindered, right? They don't have to wait for that other feature to be completed. They can sort of start grooving and moving forward, which is super important. So in the end, what you get is you got a lot of positive momentum. You have far fewer blockers, right? Remember back in the day, if there was a feature that one of the programmers did, let's say for the build system, and that never came online, then that would sort of screw over the whole entire team. The other thing it allowed to do was for the teams to be a lot more self-sufficient. So there was less babysitting, right? Because each team was self-sufficient. I don't know what pushing a pizza into the middle, it looks self-sufficient to me, but it was important for each of the teams to be able to move and be independent on their own, which was super important. Now, there was a drawback. The drawback is where a team might have one build engineer for the whole entire team, you might now have build engineers in each of the pods. So there's a lot more redundancy sometimes on a project because you want them to be self-sufficient, to authenticate each of their own individual areas. So that's a really important part of it too. But overall, what it does is it allows a team to sort of work better together. I had to put a cheesy thing up here, but the teamwork makes the dream work. That's how the saying goes. So it allowed us to do a lot more things a lot faster and drove us to be able to do more live services. So that is what allowed us to graduate. Once we had sort of mastered live services, we're able to work on a whole new chapter of products based on all that experience, right? So we got the source code review stuff under wraps. Then we had the porting aspect of it, and then once we mastered live services, that's when we were able to work on these a lot bigger projects. And that caused us to expand. So we were able to open a second studio. So we're based in Chicago, Illinois. And then in 2012, we opened up a studio in Orlando and grew the company then. At the time, it was about 30 people in 2012, and that built it up to 50. And then now we're over 140 in those 2 locations. We've been around as long as DevGam. So Larica was up here earlier talking about 2008. We started 10 years ago. And I love it because during Randy's presentation, he talked about the 3 phases of Gearbox, right? The crawl, walk, run, and how crawling was all about the work for hire, right? Walking was the new IP stuff, and the running was the publishing, the cool stuff they're doing now. We're still in the the first 10 years, first 11 years, so we're still in the crawl phase. We're working on some new original IPs as well, but that stuff was really important because what it's allowed us to do by working on other people's products and seeing other people's source code is it's allowed us to get better faster, right? You think about Team A that's maybe working on a sports franchise for 10 years, right? They're doing the same thing. They're building sneakers or for 10 years. Whereas we get to work on such a variety of different projects, we're able to see how a bunch of different companies look at the way in which they interact. And that's super important because it makes us see what sins they have to pay for in development and then what could basically benefit us over time. So what were our big lessons? A lot of the stuff I've talked about was quite technical, but from it we sort of derived a lot of big lessons that helped us get better over time. So the first one is to start small, right? Start somewhere where you can absolutely master and be really good at what you're doing. So if you're just one person at one studio doing one thing, do that until you're really good at it, but start small and grow over time. It's really, really important to just do what you can for now. A lot of people's first project, they're like, yeah, we can do this whole massive thing in this 4-year scope, but the reality is you won't be able to execute, right? And because of that, you end up failing. And that's, you still learn from the failures, but start small and move slowly. It's also a marathon, not a sprint, blah, blah, blah. But it's really important to do gradual, right? You might want to make a 100-person studio eventually. You might want to make a massive Skyrim-type game. But you have to also pay the bills, as Randy touched on earlier, right? You have to make sure along the journey that you are moving slowly, you're making the right moves, and that it's going to be, you want to be in business for a long time. That's the dirty little secret about the games industry. Everyone can be a game developer, but very few of us have business acumen to pay the bills. And so it's important to focus on that part of the business too. One of the most underrated things on the planet is getting the right people for the right roles. A lot of people are like, oh, I can do 6 different things. But chances are you might not be doing them amazingly well. Like if you need a blue jay, that's a paladin, or a seagull, that's a bard. It's super important to find the right people for your team to focus on the right things. And if you don't do that, then that could be a massive, massive problem. If you find the wrong lawyer, if you find the wrong designer, lead designer, it might be somebody that you're friends with, but they might not be able to work well with you. Right? And it's important to know that stuff when you're building a project, when you're building a game, when you're building a business. I don't know how many countless times I've heard stories about a studio that's been destroyed by one person because they had a really bad attitude or they just didn't align to it. So if you start to get that feeling like there isn't that one person that's jiving with the rest of them, then you got to make that change very quickly. Because if you let that change stay, it can poison the well, and really I've seen studios crumble because 1 or 2 people are not aligned with the rest of them. And same goes with what things they're focusing on. If you want to make a graphically high-fidelity game, like the best in the industry, and you don't have an amazing shit-hot graphics rendering person, that's a huge challenge. That's something you should probably fix. So make sure you have the right people. Same with online. If you want to do a lot of online stuff and you want 100-player multiplayer matches and you don't have anyone that's done it, I was meeting with a studio recently, and they said they had their PC game, and they were going to port it over to the consoles. And it was going to take one guy 3 months. It absolutely will fucking not. That's not going to happen. That person had no experience doing any console development. And so it's important that you find people. And it might not be, we live in an awesome place now where there's so many contract workers that have a lot of experience. So it doesn't have to be somebody that you have to hire and take that burden on the whole time, but it's somebody that you can maybe work with or another studio you can help, you can have help you. Another thing, as Randy was doing his presentation this morning, I was like, you're stealing my points. It's great. Prioritization is so important, right? Having a focus of what stuff you're going to prioritize. What's important to you as a studio? Is it more important to make a 90-rated game, or is it more important to make money from that game and build your second one? Is it more important that, you promised this media outlet it would be out in a certain day? Is it more important for that game to be better and you push it out? So making sure you're prioritizing the work that you're doing, you're focused, you're setting goals for your team, that's super, super important. Because if you're not doing that, then you're not making forward progress. I've talked to people that have been like, I've been working on my game for 5 years. Like, when's it coming out? They're like, I don't know. I'm like, that's the problem. Not all of us have that ability to be able to just work on a game forever. Except for Jonathan Blow, who will be speaking later today. Does your game have multiplayer? If so, then you should double your schedule. Multiplayer adds a massive ton of complexity. A lot of times people come to me, they're like, we were going to work on our game for about 6 months, and then we're going to add this 4-player multiplayer focus. And just like Borderlands, it took 1 month, Randy, to add 4-player multiplayer? It takes a lot. 2 weeks. Only at Gearbox. So make sure you're always thinking about the complexity that multiplayer may add to your project. That's super important. And then the other thing is that as you look, we talked earlier about success on one platform. You might have success on PC. Just remember, it's really important to go to new platforms, but each one of them adds a layer of complexity. Each one of those new platforms are new requirements, new problems, new challenges you have to face, and you need specialists that can handle it. Especially if you're making problems, or let's say you're trying to fix a bug for PS4, but that has a negative impact on the Nintendo Switch version. So just always remember that those issues of complexity are going to get greater and greater over time. Now, usually, the return on investment, the money you get from those additional platforms, benefits you, right? It allows you to create that scale. But it can be a challenge. And then you always have to be evolving, right? We talked a lot today, the theme, and I think the next couple of days is going to be all about evolving and improving and trying new things. And I didn't want to end the presentation with an adapt or die, bro. That's kind of not a good thing. Because the reality is when you don't adapt, then you fail, and that's okay, right? Failure has been one of the biggest learning aspects of my whole entire career. Failure is the most important gift you can give to yourself and the team. We had one project at Iron Galaxy that didn't go very well, but afterwards everyone was super vocal about the project. And when you think about it, when people sort of said, if we could do it over, maybe we shouldn't have done that project, I think that project was one of the most important projects we've ever done. Because all those mistakes that we made, all those problems that we faced, all this challenge that we faced, we were able to look at them in the eye, put them all up stage, and say, we're not going to do those again, right? I failed a lot in my career. I've made bad deals. I've made bad decisions. But in the end, all of them have made me better as a person, right? And that's super, super important. And then the one thing, too, that's been a big theme in the games industry lately is you can do all of this, and you can do it without crunching. Don't put yourself and your well-being, mental and emotional and health, don't put it above the game that you're making. That's super important. There's things outside of this industry that are super important. I take pride that our studio doesn't work overtime, so every night I get to have dinner with my family. Every weekend I spend with my 2 kids and my wife, and it's super, super important. So as you become you all here are becoming the next generation of game developers, you're going to be creating studios, you're going to be working with people. Make sure that you advocate for work-life balance. Make sure that you're putting pressure on your management to treat you with respect. And I was part of the problem for the first half of my career. I was the one pressing people and passive-aggressively wanting them to come in to work early and work super late. And you can be the stop to it, right? You can be part of the change and improvement. So I want to leave lots of time for questions. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for the talk. So no crunches in Iron Galaxy? Not at all?
Nope.
Oh, okay. Okay, so if you have questions, please stand here in line. It will be better so people see that you're asking questions and can take a place after you. Okay.
Cool.
And please talk in the microphone because it's all be recorded. It's very important.
Hi, Peter. Your mic is off.
Oh, sorry, I forgot to turn it off.
Okay,
yeah.
My name is Peter, and I wanted to know how your train of thoughts go in case when you do balance patches, particularly for Killer Instinct, how much you spend when analyzing community feedback, how much you look into statistics, and do you weight in the performance of the pro players, and when you look at statistics, how much do you look at the higher leagues, so as higher skilled players,
Sure.
And how much do you weight in the casuals?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. So Peter asked about the balance. How do we, in Killer Instinct specifically, how do we balance the characters when you're basically getting feedback from the user base, from the pro players, from the statistics of usage? It's a huge balancing act that Adam Hart, Keats, and his design team handle. It's primarily a lot of combinations. It's, they see problems that come out in the patch and they see where maybe they feel like one character got nerfed, another character is too OP now. It's balancing that out with what potential impact it's going to have the pro players. That's usually not a huge high priority. It's usually about the overall user base and the overall sort of balance of the characters themselves. And some of it is to do with statistics, when they see how many people are pulling off moves and stuff like that. But they're the super smart guys. I'm the idiot that picks it up and loses to them all the time. So they have a very sort of long methodology. I bet if you tweeted at Adam Hart, that he would explain sort of the process and how we do it.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Peter.
Hello.
Hi.
I have a question regarding this. Obviously, Iron Galaxy works for a lot of impressive franchises, a lot of interesting universes, but every indie developer is basically has his dream game that he's going to create. Everybody has his her own ideas.
Yep.
So could you maybe elaborate on the pros of working for somebody else's game, which people don't usually imagine when they go into the industry? Pros, or maybe why you should at least try working for somebody else and their game?
Yeah. I think there absolutely is pros and cons. The pros are you get to hang out with creative geniuses. When we started working with Bethesda, for example, we were just a work-for-hire studio. We did the Elder Scrolls Online. We were able to talk about like user interface and stuff like that, improvements. And then over time, then we started working on Fallout. And then we started working on the Skyrim Switch port. And that's sort of when Todd Howard, right, who's the creative mastermind over Fallout and Skyrim, he took notice to us. And so through the process, he was like, hey, do you guys have any ideas for controller input or for different characters? And then that allowed us to be on Fallout 76, where we were more of a co-development. So we were able to sort of like get in touch with him. He was impressed with the work we were doing. And then we became more of a voice in the creative process. It really depends, right? I mean, fundamentally, one of the most important aspects of Iron Galaxy is we want to create a stable workplace for people to work together on awesome projects with their best friends till we retire. That's sort of the master goal. And so with doing that, being the best in the business at working for other people is super important. But, you know, Randy touched on this earlier, that can't be everything because people still have creative aspects that they want to explore. So we do work on original stuff as well. It is definitely a balance on what people get to work on, whether it's just, hey, do this for this one project or do something fully creative. But the pros is that you get to work with so many genius developers and see the way in which they do things and they inspire creativity and then take the best of that and utilize that for yourself. So there's a lot of neat pros. Like you get to see different things, different worlds, different universes, and work with a lot of different code bases too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, Adam.
Hi.
Thank you for your lecture.
Sure.
I have a couple of questions to you. So my questions would be, what were the most challenges for you when you were growing your studio from 50 to 100 and from 100 to 140? And what were the main challenges when opening second office in other location? Did you bring people from Chicago to Orlando, or how did you manage this?
Those are great questions. Dave, so I've only been here for 3 years, right? Dave was the one that went through that with Chelsea, our COO. But I've heard enough stories that I know. One of the most important aspects that people talk about is the power of power of three. So every time you grow by 3x, from one person to 3 people, from 3 to relatively 10, 10 to 30, 30 to 100, 100 to 300. Each of those phases, sort of you have this massive cultural shift. And the biggest challenge between, I'd say, 50 and 100 was the second studio. So we basically started a studio in Orlando. We thought we were going to hire 5 people. Overnight, we had 18. So the team went from, I think, 30 to 48. And we did put a person down there. Luckily, we had somebody that worked in the Orlando studio named Tom Carbone that Dave Lang had worked with previously, so he's able to be down there. And we had a lot of our people, Chelsea, Dan Coleman, Daryl Wisner, that would go down quite often to make sure that they understood the culture. But it definitely is, like even now when we look at each studio, even though they all sort of super serve the values of Iron Galaxy, it's very, very different, right? The joke I always make is Orlando's all about board games and bake sales, and Chicago's about bourbon and bratwurst, right? So even though we all work together, they feel a little bit different when you're in the studio. But it's super important to allow them to have their own sort of their signature, right? The way that they operate. But they all know what's important. And working on different projects. The other thing that we wanted to do is we didn't want each studio to have their own identity when it comes to making a product. So there's no Orlando projects. There's no Chicago projects. Everything is done across both studios. We have about 14 people that work remote from all around the world, and that's really important to us. We didn't want to have that like, oh, that's a Chicago thing, it's better or worse. So it's the biggest challenge, I think, has just been making sure that you don't feel too corporate. Before I joined, there was no human resources department, so we had to do that. And of course, everyone's like, now Dave won't swear a lot. Well, he still swears a ton, but we just have more rigor. We have better benefits for the company, for the employees. We have more policies and stuff like that. But it means that, so you have to sort of instill that, some people see it as rigor, right? Process, having budgets and stuff like that. But in reality, that's what creates the longevity and the stability for the company.
Thank you.
Sure. Thanks.
Hi, Adam.
Hi.
I'm Lisa.
Hi, Lisa.
It's a great pleasure to see you today. Thank you for your lecture.
Sure.
You told us about porting AAA projects, and it's really cool. Do you have any project under NDA you can't mention?
That's a great question. We have a lot of projects under NDA right now, at least 5, and I can mention none of them. The next year is going to be super exciting. We've got a lot of awesome stuff we're working on for a lot of awesome partners, but that's all I can say. Even if you feed me all your vodka, it's not going to happen. I'm a vault.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, let me ask you one.
Sure.
You mentioned a lot of games that you worked on, but most of them, I mean ports now.
Sure.
And most of them was ports between different platforms.
Yeah.
Sometimes it was some kind of step back when you need to port Borderlands to Vita. It's very not good hardware. So yeah, it was a real adventure for you.
Yeah.
And what about ports to the next generation?
Cool.
Is it some kind of different work to do? And what's your expectations, don't run your NDA, but what's your expectations about next generation consoles? Is it would be easier to make ports between platforms because I think the situation with the PlayStation 3 won't come again when there was some cell with 8 cores and all this thing.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. It's a lot easier when you're going up, right? Actually, we did it with the Bulletstorm project. So what we did is we were working on the PS4 Pro version and the Xbox One X version. So you just go to the PC specs and you just crank everything to the top, right? And you see how it runs, and then you do sort of engine-based optimizations. So that is by far our team's favorite kind of work that we can do, because we can basically say a lot of times studios now they're making their textures in sometimes 8K and stuff like that. So their textures are usually built and the models are usually built, and then they've dumbed them down already to run on current gen consoles. So it's a lot easier to go reverse without having to rebuild every single thing in super high resolution or super high poly counts. No, that is definitely one of our favorite challenges. I think for next gen, I think is absolutely going to be easier, because the move from PS3 to PS4 I think was the hardest for any developer, because it was finally, Sony finally woke up and realized that they should be working on CPU-based architecture. And now that everyone's doing that, like even Nintendo Switch, this is a lot far more easier to work on than it's ever been in the history of Nintendo platforms. And so I would imagine that they're all going in the same direction for the next gen, and so it's going to be even easier, because we just look to our PC counterparts. We look at sort of the max, because right now PCs are so highly performant, right? Chances are the next gen of consoles will probably be around where max gen PC is. So chances are a lot of games that we're working on right now will just be able to crank it all up to 11, and then they'll probably work. But I don't know anything about those new consoles, so that's all conjecture.
And the port to the next generation is easier and faster.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, never fast, never easy, because that would put us out of business.
Comparing to the...
It's always a challenge,
Sure.
always a challenge, and you should call Iron Galaxy to help you.
Okay, and maybe you can give some tips to the developers what they need to think about to create a game that would be really easy to port in the future if they decided to spread around the platforms.
Yeah, I think one of the most important things is picking one of the main engines. Picking Unreal or Unity is important. Once you have one of those in mind, sticking as closely as you can to the out-of-the-box code base. As soon as you start creating a lot of custom stuff, you might be able to push the boundaries of that engine a lot further, but it will definitely be more expensive down the road to bring it to other consoles, right? Because those other consoles might have different rules and regulations around what can and can't be done. So trying to stick to the ground, the baseline of the platform, that's important. It really sounds sad, but it's the less new shit you try, the easier it will be. So you'll never, if you want a ton of innovation, if you want to build like No Man's Sky, that's going to be a lot harder to port because it's trying and pushing so many things in new directions. But if you're making an indie game and you're using GameMaker or you're using Unity, then it's going to be relatively easy. Now, there still is going to be a lot of traps that you fall into because TRCs and TCRs, which are all of the different regulations that the platforms have, there's books, Bibles worth of challenges you have to face and things you have to adhere to. So you have to make sure that you're mindful of all of those, because you might have this new awesome way in which you actually give content away in your game. You have a new key system, like the Borderlands has it, the shift system, right? The shift system, any system in which you rely on that to unlock content in your game, you need to go through approvals to get that using on the platform. And so that can also be challenging. So the more you stick to sort of the regular vanilla, the easier it is, but that doesn't mean it's the right thing to do for your product, right? You should follow your game first, the passion you have for what you want to build, and then if it has success, then you can bring it to other platforms also.
Okay. Any questions, maybe? Okay, so one for me.
Sure.
Ports versus your own IP.
Yeah.
When, maybe, I don't know how to ask exactly, you have a lot of projects, you say you have 5 more projects to work on, and maybe more ports, maybe not, but how to decide for you, I'm thinking maybe it's not so really good question for everyone, but for you,
sure.
How you decide to make brand new IP and not take another port from someone, from Microsoft?
Yeah, that's a great question. At any one time, we're working on 12 to 16 different projects. So there's a ton of different things we're doing. Some of them are just a few people working on one thing or another. But one of the big deciding factors is we never want to be in a scenario. The reason why we've been around for 10 years, we've never taken any external investment, we've never had layoffs, and people don't crunch, which is very unique, especially for the US market. But one of that is because we built the whole company around stability. And because let's say Studio A is working on 1 or 2 big projects, like Randy talked about his team working on one project and it gets canceled. I just had a phone call last night, literally last night, from a friend of mine that runs a studio. He said, project just got canceled, I'm laying everyone off tomorrow. I'm like, holy shit, I'm in Russia, I have to go to sleep. I'm kidding. I talked to him. But that's a horrible scenario to be in, right? And he's 20 people, right? We have 140, so a lot more mouths to feed. So by having a lot of different projects, if project A gets canceled, like for example, Telltale went out of business, and we were doing 7 Days to Die, right? Telltale laid off 350 people. I can't lay off the team that was working on that project, but I'm an independent company. And so we had to absorb the losses from that. We placed people on other projects by calling up our partners and saying, hey, do you need 2 artists for this, 3 engineers from that? We were able to place all the people on our own team overnight. And so we still lost money from them pulling out and not paying us, but we were able to survive that. And so it's very important for us to have that balance. Now, all that being said, creativity in our own IPs, as Randy said, when we start to look at the longevity of the company, we want to create IPs so we have long-term value as a company. If we're only ever doing ports till the end of time, we're only as good as the last port we worked on, right? So it's very important for us to build proprietary technology that we own. It's important for us to build intellectual property that we own. And that also allows people to spread their experiences too. So it's always a balance with every decision we make. If we don't want to do overnight, have everyone working on some new IP, because if that went away, then we're out of business. And when we're focused on stability, which is super important to the company, then we need to sort of build that balance into our plans. So that's why right now I'd say about a quarter of the studio is working on new stuff, new IP, and the rest of them are working on other people's products.
And so you have one team for all projects. There are no separate department that can doing only ports and the other are doing only your own.
Everyone's
games.
the same. Everyone's treated equally. They're all working on, one person might be working on Diablo, then they're working on Crash Bandicoot, then they're working on Skyrim, it all depends. But usually, sometimes if people have been working on like a mobile game, they might work on another mobile game. The Switch team that did Skyrim, a lot of the same people did Diablo 3 for Switch and work on new stuff, so sometimes it is similar. Hi.
Okay.
Hi, thank you for your lecture.
Sure.
My question about QA and testing, how important is it, and how much it costs for a studio how much money, how much time?
What was the question for testing? For testing the game. It's a super high priority. You know, my first 8 years in the games industry was testing. So we have a full-time team, about 8 QA testers in the studio, and they're more doing functional testing. And then for big projects, when we're working with big partners, then oftentimes we work with external outsource companies, and there could be 100+ people testing the game for a certain amount of time. And they're going to be the ones doing the functionality testing and the the certification testing. That stuff's super, super important. So I'd say the back half of the project is when QA gets involved and test gets involved, but it's a huge, huge important part of it because they're, to me, the last line of defense before it goes out in the wild. And if they don't do a great job, then the game isn't going to come across well, and then the gamers themselves are going to give you a lot of crap. So we have to make sure that they're as equipped as they possibly can be.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And about outsource, you mentioned Q&A, that you use outsource sometimes, and what else? How much work you're outsourcing?
We outsource a lot, actually. So we outsource a lot of art. When we're creating a lot of art content for some of our products, we're working Killer Instinct. We worked with a lot of art outsourcing companies. So we have to go to, obviously, when we work with Microsoft and Killer Instinct, we're trying to, execute on their vision, but we also have constraints around we don't want to hire 40 new people. So we work with art outsourcing companies as well. So that's on certain projects. But we are always very clear with our partner that we're going to be using another sort of subsidiary or another partner to outsource to, because that would be a bad thing if we sort of basically grabbed a project and then just send it off to someone else. That would be kind of not a good thing. So right now we're actually here, and I'm spending much time in Eastern Europe trying to find studios to work with on the engineering front. So it's not just about the art side of things, but we want to do more co-development, because as we expand our purview and our projects and stuff like that, we want to be able to find ways to work with new partners and potentially work on more projects.
And how often are you hiring new people? I mean, maybe you're doing some time by time, or only when you really need them for a new project, for example?
Yeah, that's a great question. So hiring at Iron Galaxy is very organic. We want to make sure that people, when we hire people, that we see a long-term sort of growth path for them so they can be at the company for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. Hiring just one specialist for one project is not really a focal point of us. We want to make sure that we have people that are going to be with us for a long time. Many of our employees, the first 12 people we hired, 11 of them are still here, and that's really important to us. So we want to make sure we find roles that people can stay for a long time.
Okay. Thank you.